Thanks very much, Toby. Hola a todos, kia ora koutou, and hi everyone. So today we're going to travel to the semi-arid Andes, the Chilean half. And what I hope to do today is a little bit experimental, at least for me, which is to not focus so much on just the science that we do in the Andes, but also how we work together with communities to make our science even better. So I would say that if you are interested in knowing a little bit more too about the photo that I have in the background here of these amazing penitentes, I'll just do a plug for an IGS seminar that was given in 2020 by Steve Warren and available to watch on YouTube. And unfortunately, that's the only photo of penitentes that we're going to see today. But we are going to see some spectacular landscapes and have a think about the type of science that we can do when we work together. So again, we're heading to Chile, which is on the west coast of South America. It's a long, narrow country, so you might be familiar with what happens, especially in the south, thinking about Patagonia. But today, we're going to head to the northern section, which are the arid Andes, and in particular, we will head into this region here, which is the Coquimbo region. Let me just put on my laser pointer. The Coquimbo region here, which kind of straddles the arid diagonal. So here is basically the southern extent of the Atacama Desert, and that's where we're focusing in on. So it wouldn't be remiss to describe this area as dry. When you're in La Serena, which is where CEAZA, the institution that's hosted this research, is, we're dealing with mean annual precipitation of around 80 millimeters per year. And as we head up into the Andes at the divide between Chile and Argentina, we're talking about precipitation rates of around 200 millimeters per year. So these are really low rates. They're maybe high by the arid Andes standards. But what that means is that every drop of water is important, because every drop of water is used in the lowland areas, not only for human consumption and also for the flora and fauna that inhabit this area, but it also is where we develop Chilean pisco, for example. So from a cultural and entertainment perspective, quite important to know what's happening in terms of the water. From a resource perspective, most of the rainfall and precipitation happens in the winter months between May and August, but it's quite episodic, which means that we get a handful of events and the timing can change from year to year. The timing of precipitation is largely dictated by ENSO, but it's also modulated by the Madden-Julian oscillation. So one El Nino to another tends not to be quite the same in terms of precipitation that we receive on the ground. But just by way of example, we have here precipitation monthly totals from 2014 and a comparison with 2015, which was an El Nino year. And you can see that in terms of totals, the amount that's being received in the upper headwaters is quite different. So understanding kind of that variability between dry and wet years is important for thinking about how much water we might receive downstream in any given year, but also what some of the consequences might be. And in terms of thinking about that variability, you only have to talk to people who live in the region to get a really clear picture of how that pans out, both in terms of dry periods and wet periods, and what that might mean on the ground. This is a timeline that we constructed with people from a elders club in the forefield of the Andes, who have nicely documented through their lives when they've had dry periods and wet periods and what the consequences have been. So they're very aware of individual events, but also periods that have caused, say, more hazards such as landsliding, but also how it's affected their crops and how the flora and fauna have responded to those changes. So in terms of allies, of thinking about what's happening and also understanding the consequences, they're our closest colleagues in this space. So when we think about what's going on in the Andes, it's very difficult for us to separate that from the people that live downstream. And so all of the science that we develop in CEAZA in the glaciology group has been done hand in hand with the people that inhabit those regions, but also who may be there to make political decisions and also be affected downstream. So it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the support and wisdom that comes from those people. And as well as that, in terms of access into the mountains in this region, given that most is in private territory, they've also allowed us access to those spaces, which we're quite grateful for. So it's important, I guess, for us to mention in terms of working in with communities that clearly we come from different perspectives and have different opinions on what may or may not be happening, but creating safe spaces and instances for dialogue is incredibly important, and recognizing that we might not all come at the same direction, but in the end, we all have the same goal, which is to improve the understanding of uncertainty in these regions. In terms of other people that are really important in making this happen, it would also be remiss not to mention that everything we're going to talk about from here on through is done not just by myself, but also with a whole team of professional students and postdocs that make this happen. And so these are just a snapshot of many of the characters that we will see the labors of throughout this presentation. But it's important to think that not only do we need to have that good scientific collaboration, but working hand in hand with people who help us connect with the community in a more reasonable way is also important. So here in the team, we also have professionals that are experts in outreach and also coordination and communication. So here's a big ups to all of them as well. So in terms of what we're really aiming to do, our main goal in the research that we do in the Andes is to really reduce the uncertainty in terms of the estimation of water delivery from the headwaters. And this might seem a bit strange as a glaciology group to not have the word snow or ice anywhere near that main goal. But essentially, in order for us to think about water supply in such a dry region where at least 80% of the water that's used comes from the mountains, understanding those cryospheric processes is the number one concern to think about water supply eventually. So our kind of main driving questions that we have to answer this goal are really to think about what's causing cryospheric change in the semi-arid Andes. How does that change impact the hydrological system? And then eventually, how can we use this information to improve resource management? I feel like the improving resource management needs to be almost all in quotes, because clearly snow, ice, and water is not just a resource to be exploited, but has many other purposes outside of that. And also the idea of improving something can also be a bit contentious, depending on your perspective. But in any case, I digress. So when we head up into the headwaters, here we're talking about a zone. The snow line starts at about 2,000 meters above sea level and extends up to a bit over 6,000 meters above sea level. So it's quite a wide elevation band in a very narrow space. The sector of the Andes is about kind of 40 to 50 kilometers wide. So it increases in elevation quite quickly. Even though we're here in the desert, snow tends to be the predominant source of runoff for the region, but that is supported in drier periods by glaciers and rock glaciers and other permafrost features as well. Snow really is key though, and if we just take a quick snapshot of the contribution of the different sources in the headwaters, especially in kind of glaciated catchments. We can see these numbers are only indicative here. We can see that in years when snow is quite predominant, our contribution from glaciers, debris-covered glaciers, diminishes somewhat, which is largely caused by the change in albedo of the glacier surface, allowing less ice melt those years. But we can see that in the years when snowfall clearly hasn't been so dominant is when our glaciers, debris-covered glaciers, and to a certain extent other cryoforms become important for maintaining our base flow. But again, this is a kind of a simplistic overview of what is happening in the headwaters. And some of this comes about because we have reasonably limited data sets. We have the elevation range, which is quite large. We have limited roads and inputs into these areas, which means that the data that we're dealing with to come up with some of these estimations is also based on a lot of back of the envelope calculations, one might say. So this means that in order for us to understand where our water is coming from, we need to employ a diversity of measurement techniques. Also, when you're interested in thinking about all sources, so snow and ice, clearly that opens up the need to incorporate techniques that maybe might not be quite as familiar to some of you in terms of monitoring what's happening with our permafrost, what's happening under the ground, as well as more traditional glaciological techniques. This essentially means that we can start to understand the first part of the problem, which is our source. However, we always have in the back of our head that it's not just the source that's going to be relevant here, but also how that plays out. So again, it's quite a complicated set of problems that we have to deal with, but let's get down to basics. So the first question that we need to answer for thinking about how much water we might have available to us in these catchments is just how much snow is there anyway? How is it distributed spatially? When does it occur, and what is driving those changes? So, like I think any good scientific group, we started out thinking about what are the classic measurements that we can make to understand our snow processes. So clearly we have a few tools available, which include satellite products. They include that will tell us something about snow coverage. We have an array of meteorological stations, so we can see all of these blue triangles on this image relate to meteorological stations that the center has installed in the wider region. We can do snow pits, and we can also go out into the field occasionally to do things like LiDAR scans. But I think we'll all agree that this gets us to a certain part of the solution to how much snow there is, but it's going to be really dependent on quite where we have access and also the capabilities to measure. One of the problems that we often have with measuring snow is that you need to be on site when it's happening in order to get measurements that are kind of a little bit more trustworthy, one might say, in terms of what the quality of snow is actually like. And clearly for an institution that's based at the coast, being on site when it's snowing is a little bit of non-possibility, one might say. So this meant that we had an idea that, in fact, we were going to need some help with this, especially to understand maybe not so much what was happening in the upper regions where we had stations installed, but especially around the fringes where we know that the snow to rain transition can be quite variable and quite complicated to understand. And that's when a serendipitous conversation occurred with people that were thinking about citizen science already to develop a program of monitoring within the mountains of people who habit those areas more frequently than we do, and also live within those areas. So in 2014, the citizen science program from CEAZA, which had previously only focused on understanding rubbish distribution within coastal areas, was trying to expand its program, and so went to the local community in all of the region to ask what areas were of main interest to the wider community. And with a resounding unanimous agreement, water was top of the list in terms of what was happening. So at that same time, we were thinking about how can we do things better, and so we brought together the need of having better snow information with a desire of the community to know more about what was happening within the water space. And so together we developed a program which we've called Vecinos de las Nieves, or Snow Neighbors, to understand really what's happening in the headwaters. Now this program that we developed started off only with a handful of points, and we now have 40 volunteers involved, which might not necessarily sound like a lot, but when you understand the sparsity of inhabitants within the foothills in this zone, you'll understand that this is a reasonably significant fraction of population that's being represented here. So the interesting thing with the Snow Neighbors program is that it was co-created, which means that whilst we had the idea of measuring snow, what I was originally envisaging was thinking about snow depth and density, and that's where we would more or less end things, because I figured that no one would be interested in doing much else than that, and boy was I wrong. So together we have started off with a program that was not only measuring depth and density, but also other characteristics that were actually of real interest to the people there to understand more about the quality of snow that they were receiving. So it turns out people are really keen to think about crystals and what the individual snowflakes look like. They were also interested in thinking about the quality, so thinking about hardness and how that might change in space. And also in the start, we realized when we were talking to different communities that each community in the Andes had its own language with regards to the snow. So we're also developing a glossary of terms that depend on the quality of snow as it's falling. So whether that snow is mixed in with rain or not. And it turns out that communities that might only be a few kilometers apart actually speak about snow in a very different way, which has been quite a gratifying experience to think about retaining culture that is inherent in the elders in these communities in particular. So in terms of being able to undertake all of that work, we realized that because of most of the communities that we're dealing with are reasonably vulnerable communities, that we were going to need to work hand in hand to make sure that we weren't not only exploiting their good nature, but we're also able to interact in a way that was going to be positive for everyone involved. And so that meant not only being able to supply equipment, but also training in terms of how to use equipment and what that might mean long term. And as well as that, also incorporating new studies into the palette or the array of experiments that they were already undertaking that were of interest to them as well. So we developed this manual for undertaking snow measurements and a kit as well of equipment, which is also why it's limiting as to how many groups you can have involved. And the beauty here is that we started this finally in 2018, and we've had measurements every year since then, including over the last 2 years, which has been just incredible to witness. And the thing that's been interesting for both the participants and for us is how things have changed even within those kind of 4 years of measurements. And that's included moving from snow to more of a rain environment. And so in the last year, we've also added manual pluviometers into the study. And as well as that, we've included isotope measurements as well, or sampling as well. So this program cuts across the community. So the other interesting thing is that we've included everyone here, from school groups to individuals to community groups to the water owners associations in Chile that look after reservoirs, to the Chilean police, and more. And what's been incredible is to have this diverse array of participants who would not normally communicate with each other, really coming together for a common goal. The program has been kind of so successful among the communities in the mountains that we've also last year expanded it to include school groups as well, so that there's now a network of school communities within the Andes who are also observing snow in their region, which is quite a cool thing to see unfold. Now, one might expect that the pandemic has thrown up a few challenges here, because a lot of that program was done face-to-face, and so it had to be moved online. And Simone Schellwecker, who I believe is here today, she developed a new idea last year that has expanded upon the program, and that made it possible for us to keep connected even when we were at home. And that was with the incorporation of taking photos of snow in the mountains to think about where our snow lines were. So this is a new part that's been added on, and is perhaps less face-to-face or less intensive than the original kind of Snow Neighbours program. But the beauty here has been that one of the outcomes of the pandemic in Chile, with the need to do virtual schooling, is that more families in the mountains have access to phones and communication tools, which has enabled the participation within this type of activity, which might not have been possible previously. So it's been an interesting process to see how the program has developed, but also how the community, whilst you think that people might only want to do one or two things, maybe there's actually a need and a hunger to understand what's going on a little bit more, which makes us need to be a little bit more responsive maybe to what's going on. So in terms of that snow that then falls on the ground, there's clearly also a desire to understand how much of that is melting and how much might be included into the catchment. And here we have another wide community set of stakeholders, one might say, that are interested in understanding quite how much of that water is added into the catchment, as I said, because every drop counts here. And so in 2016, we started talking together with the regional government departments, as well as our water users associations and individual communities, to think about how we can develop better science in this area, to think about how much is melting, how much is being contributed, and whether there are different ways that we can manage the snow that falls. So I don't want to labor the point here too much, but what this study taught us, which was the development of thinking about ways to model and monitor sublimation, and whether there are ways to manage that, brought this diverse group of stakeholders together for a common theme. What has been interesting in this process is that we often perhaps underestimate what people are capable of thinking about or dealing with in their everyday lives. And to this point, most of these stakeholders will now happily tell you about sublimation, the distribution of sublimation, and the fact that if we can reduce things like wind speed by the use of a snow fence, for example, we can potentially manage the snow in our catchments. So this program in particular was interesting from being able to do science that's publishable in and of itself, but also to get practical solutions, possibly or not, for people who really need to be taking those day-to-day decisions in such an arid area. So from those studies, we kind of had that understanding of what was happening with snow, but we're also wary that as a glaciology group, ice tends to be what we want to focus on more, even if our snow is more important. And so over the last few years, we've also managed to start thinking about where our base flow comes from in terms of glaciers and rock glaciers. And so have been working in together with also the same set of local stakeholders to think about what glaciers are doing and how we might want to manage them better moving forward. So here in the arid Andes, whilst precipitation rates are quite low, we still have some glaciers which are largely relics from former times, including glaciers such as the Tapado Glacier, which is one of the emblematic glaciers in the region. Interesting thing about glaciers in the arid Andes is that you get penitentes, as Steve has talked about previously, but as well as that, you often get complex landforms where you might have a glacier that is connected to a debris covered glacier and also to rock glaciers, which may be active and inactive, all within the same complex. As well as that, in these areas, you are dealing with rock glaciers, which can also be standalone as well. So these landforms are hideously complex to understand from a hydrological perspective. However, they also give us the opportunity to think about the nature of ice bodies in these areas. So here, together with the community, which might sound a bit strange, we've been doing a lot of work thinking not just about these emblematic forms, but also about the rest of the ice that is buried within these catchments. So I said that the Andes are quite steep and they're quite narrow and very long. And within the semi-arid regions, you don't find too many kind of standard glaciers, but you do find an awful lot of rock glaciers or hidden ice. So just for those of you who may not have their eyes quite trained in to the rock glaciers that are present in this image, here is a little bit of a suggestion of where we estimate there may or may not be ice buried within the landscape in just a reasonably small space. So you can see that from the outset, in terms of understanding where there might be ice in the catchment, becomes really important because ice clearly is a stored water source as well. So this idea of thinking about where the ice is not only has implications for water resources and us understanding base flow, but it actually has possibilities for the way that communities can think about and look after their own catchments as well. So in the Coquimbo region, which is a reasonably large region, there's actually no national parks in Chile, which is somewhat surprising given the diversity of biota in the area. But what there are private reserves that have started to be formed. And these private reserves are a lot of them are now being set up within the headwater areas. And one of the main reasons for doing so is for people to be able to protect their rock glaciers, understanding that rock glaciers potentially help base flow, but at the same time are an unusual phenomenon that don't happen in many places of the world. So there's an idea of here this symbiotic relationship between the community and scientists for thinking about what is actually existent within their catchments that they didn't realize were in their catchments, and then what science we can undertake to give them more information so that they can help to protect areas that they are interested in protecting as well. And I don't want to labor this point here, but it is something to consider when you listen to Andrés Riveras talk in a couple of weeks as well, when he describes the glacier protection law and thinking about these types of reserves, which currently don't fall under any kind of protection for glaciers, but people here are clearly willing to make that happen. So as well as that level of community connection with rock glaciers, glaciers in general have become reasonably important politically in Chile because they're of concern to the local community. Ever since the Pascualama mining project, which you may or may not have heard about, and if you haven't heard about it, it's worth doing a bit of Googling to understand how glaciers have changed the environmental impact assessment process in Chile. And so because they're now of community interest, that means they're also of political interest. And so since 2019, we've been undertaking a project to think about developing a glacier management plan for the region. This clearly not is us trying to tell the glaciers what they should or shouldn't be doing, but more how can we provide information that help decision-making processes more widely. So in terms of this glacier plan, obviously the first thing one must do is think about who is an actor in this process. And I put these images here not for you to try and read them, but to just get an idea of this is essentially the elements, so the ministries and the departments within the Chilean state system that have anywhere in their mandate something to do with glaciers. So when we started this process, we knew that the Ministry for Public Works had their glacier and ice division. But we had no idea that there were this number of actors that had anything to do with glaciers within the country. And I think, to be perfectly honest, a lot of these departments would also be surprised that they had something to do with glaciers in the country. And that's largely because there are not a lot of trained professionals within the wider sector that can actually understand what's happening with glaciers, manage the information in order to take decisions. So what might be an interesting thing to do generally is also to think about the country where you are at the moment and what this map might look like, because you might be surprised actually who needs the information that you are generating and what form you may need to provide that information in for it to be useful. So once we had identified the public sector, we set about trying to understand what information was actually necessary and what information people required that information to be within so that it was actually useful in the end. And so this meant that we had to do an awful lot of focus groups and surveys to get this done. However, it was quite surprising that these institutions in which had no professional connection necessarily to glaciology or to glaciers were really interested in getting upskilling as well as kind of the data being handed to them so that they could improve their decision-making processes. So leading on from this, we also needed to develop new plans for monitoring of glaciers in the region, because in order for you to be able to provide the data that people are requesting, you need to be able to generate that somehow. And so the brilliant part of this process of having communities tell you what they require is you can then go armed with that information to be able to convince the powers that be that it's necessary for it to be formed. And thanks to the development of these new glacier and rock glacier monitoring plans, we've been able to start to affect change at both a local level and also within wider policy to think about why glaciers should even be thought about in the first place, but also how we can take better decisions based on hard data rather than just on what our gut tells us. So this has been an empowering process, especially with regards to the environmental impact assessment process that I mentioned earlier that came out of the Pascua-Lama mining fiasco. Knowing that previous to us starting this, there was no training whatsoever for professionals in that system to make decisions about glaciers, to being able to train several people in everything from what is a glacier to how do we measure and monitor them to how can we interpret the data that you're receiving has been really empowering in the end, and something that I highly recommend having a look at yourselves. So based on that information system, it means that we can start projecting through to the future. And one of the things that Andres will talk about hopefully in his talk at the end of the month, which is all about the glacier protection law in Chile, is that people, once they start to understand what it is that they have within their mountains, can then start to think about what happens when that changes. What happens when we have less snow, less ice, and what might the wider implications be. And so that itself is an amazing reason to start the conversations with your local communities if you're not doing so already. So I will leave you here with Andesita, who is the character of a children's book that we've written following water within the Andes. And I hope to leave you maybe not necessarily knowing too much more about the Andes, but hopefully reflecting on how it is that you interact with your own local community and how maybe you can improve your information flow moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Shelley. We already have our first question on the chat, but just perhaps I should say now, just in case I forget to say later, that next week's seminar has been postponed due to unavoidable circumstances. So I'll obviously post that on all the usual ways, but just to have people who are here. Hopefully that also gave people a little bit of a chance to think about questions and to type them, but we already have one on the chat from Roger Clark.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tavy, and thanks, Shelley. Fascinating talk and links wonderfully to what we've heard in the past in these seminars about engagement with communities in Greenland and so on. You spoke very eloquently about how it's changed very local policies as far as conserving the glaciers, but I wonder if you think it's pushed the government in Chile to do more towards net zero within the country, to press harder at IPCC and so on. Do you think they're looking beyond just keeping what they've got in one piece?
Yeah, so I don't want to overblow too much of what we've done, because I think that's a very dangerous thing to do. However,
no,
I would say,
do.
yeah. However, I would say, you know, what's been amazing to me is that, so, I mean, I arrived in Chile in 2009, and I became the leader of the group in 2013. And from that point forward, I have noticed the dialogue change, and that's changed because I think, you know, from our group, we've been really trying to make those connections and trying to listen to what is needed from the decision makers rather than just us telling people what they need to think about. And that's meant that we've had seats at the table. So we've had seats at the table with the kind of the previous iterations of the glacier protection law, which again Andres will talk about, but we've also had seats at the table thinking about the new climate change legislation that Chile has been developing as well. So I think it really has not just at a local level, but also made that impact at the national level. And at the same time, the brilliant thing is that, you know, when I started, you know, the number of kind of maybe PhD qualified Chileans working in Chile in glaciology, you could almost count on your hands. I mean, we all know Andres Rivera and Gino Casasa, and there weren't very many past that. And what's been happening in the last couple of years is that PhD students have started to come back that have been trained by brilliant universities across the planet, and that too is helping to change the dialogue, which means that when it comes to things like glacier protection laws, there are just more voices now to be heard. And one thing that as a foreigner working in the country, I'm very aware of as well, is that need of local voices, not just the import to make those comments. So I'd also then like to say, maybe for those of you who get applications from Latin American young researchers, is also to give them a chance, because you can, not only are they brilliant, but the impact that they can have when they get back to their country is just, yeah, phenomenal. Sorry, I'll stop talking, Roger.
That's great. Thanks very much. And anything you can do to protect Chilean vineyards and their red wine would be much appreciated.
Yeah, I understand. Normally, when I normally when I try to justify our science in Chile, I do make mention that, you know, without these things, there's no pisco, there's no red wine, there's no white wine, there's no, you know, none of the fun stuff that we all like to partake of, and that tends to, you know, hit home quite quickly.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's good to have your priorities right there, Roger. Steve, do you want to go next?
Yeah. Hi, Shelley. I'm, I guess my camera's not working, but I'm here, and I congratulate you for your all your work on community engagement. But I also want to congratulate you for finding a field of champion penitentes. That first picture you showed, it's, I mean, the tallest penitentes I've read about in the literature were 8 meters, but judging by comparison with the people in the picture, it looks like they might be maybe 12 meters in that picture.
Yeah, and in fact, Steve, you need to come and visit again, I think, to update your photo selection, because so that's at the terminus of the Tapado Glacier. But when I started working there again in 2009, I mean, the penitentes were maybe a couple of meters tall. We were talking about this in the group a couple of days ago. And when they went to the field recently, not only do you have those walls, which have just, you know, grown out of sight, but on the glacier itself, they're now on the order of 3 or 4 meters high as well. So there are changes afoot as to how the penitentes as well are behaving there as well. So I think we need some good physicists to come and have another think about what's going on there, for sure.
Thank you. Inga, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Shelley. It was really interesting. Great to see everything that you've been up to. I'm just wondering if you, and sorry if you already said this, if you're planning to write up a paper on the community engagement separately from the science, because I think that could be really useful.
Yeah, so we are. So at the moment, we're just starting to be able to use some of the results that we've been generating in publications, which is clearly kind of the ultimate goal of citizen science, is to have that kind of two-way street, do something that's useful. But yeah, we're about to start writing up the experience itself, because I'm quite a naive person, I think, and often when we come into these, we think about all of the benefits and that we're doing this great thing, and we don't necessarily think about the ethics of what we're dealing with, and having really that two-way street, and also the side products. I think when we started this, we didn't think about how empowering this would also be for the community, that having, this is maybe a little bit embarrassing, but having a WhatsApp group for snow neighbors in which you have people, who would never normally talk to each other, talking about how snow changes along the mountain range, it's just really, gratifying as well as empowering. So that's our next step.
That's great, yeah, because there's not many good news stories sometimes when scientists go out and try and do these things. So I think that would be a great paper to get out there for people to be able to read.
No, that's for sure. Maybe one thing that I did forget to mention that I wanted to say too is just remembering the responsibility that comes with these types of studies as well. I think we often fall into the trap of having 2-year-long projects and needing to have communities on side, but forgetting that in fact when we pull out after 2 years, you leave a void that burns that community, that may then impact on everyone downstream as well. And so thinking about responsible practice for setting these things up.
Cool, thank you.
There are lots of congratulations in several languages on the chat, but are there any more questions that anyone would like to ask? Any more questions for Shelley? Suggestion there from Magnus that you should think about taking this to Bilbao in June. Frank, would you like to go ahead?
Oops. Yeah, of course. Thank you. Great talk, and just a standard question. You talk about that there's an idea for training, let's say also in regard to this is a glacier and this is not. And as you know, and as you have nicely shown, there is a little bit of a problem when it comes to this is a rock glacier and this is not. Do you have an idea how to address this?
Yeah, and in fact in Chile, and I didn't touch on this at all, and maybe Andres will touch on this in a couple of weeks, but what's interesting is that the definition of what a glacier is in Chile is not the scientific definition of what a glacier is. It's a very practical definition that's used really thinking about water. And so in fact in the current practical definition of a glacier in Chile, it actually includes rock glaciers and anything else you might imagine, as long as it's over a hectare in area. So yeah, it's a great question, and it's one thing that we do try to pull apart. Is that idea as well as what is the difference between a glacier and a rock glacier, but also the array of permafrost features that you can think about as well. Everything from the different formations or types of formations to come up with a rock glacier, through to when they're active, inactive, relict, etc.
Okay, thank you very much. Does that answer your question, Frank?
Yeah. Just the point is, of course, maybe not so much scientific, but you pointed out that we talk about water resources, and at some point it might be the case that the glaciers disappear much before the rock glaciers due to their protection, and then it would be good to know what is what. So from this water resources perspective, I think when you look a little bit more on the long term, it's also quite important. So good luck with that.
Okay, thank you. I think we've come to the end of the questions. There aren't any on Facebook. So comes to me again to say a huge thank you to Shelley for an absolutely fantastic talk, and really, really interesting to see sort of stakeholder analysis going on in glaciology, a completely different perspective. So thank you very much indeed. And then a reminder to everyone that next week's seminars had to be postponed. So the next seminar will actually be on the 23rd of March, when we have 3 of the early career slots going on. So yeah, I will post on CryoList and so on that there is no seminar next week, but it's had to be postponed. So thank you very much indeed to Shelley, and thank you very much to everyone for coming. So see you in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, everyone.